getting into the core of what everyone's here for today. As you already know, I'm Mark. I'm the CEO of Civo, and Civo is a cloud provider focused on cloud-native technologies such as Kubernetes. And just a little bit about my background. I've been in the technology industry for over 20 years now, and my original background was in kind of shared web hosting and domain names, and I actually founded the 5th largest hosting company in the UK, and that was actually sold in 2019. But since then, my focus is on building Civo, and that's been set up as a global cloud computing provider, and that's really where all of my focus and the team's focus is going on building Civo and our technologies. It's quite, before I get started on this, I know there's a graphic on the screen now around the kind of economic outlook, which sounds a bit doom and gloom. I thought what was interesting, and we had over 300 people register for this webinar, and I think that really demonstrates there's a lot of interest in this area of reducing cloud spend at the moment. So it's a very topical area at the moment, and I think even going back to when we were in October, we were actually exhibiting in Detroit at KubeCon, and it was pretty much the main theme as well at KubeCon. There was so many people talking about cost reduction, so it's certainly on everyone's mind at the moment. And I think the obvious reason is the current economic climate, and you can see from this graphic that in 2023 the global economy is not growing at the rate it has been. It is slowing down. Advanced economies, like the US, like much of Europe, are really starting to slow down, with only 1.1% growth predicted for 2023, and even emerging markets are stagnating as well in that respect. So obviously, I'm sure everyone's aware of cost reductions that are happening within companies and layoffs in technology sectors and things like that. And I think now in 2023, companies are really trying to look at other costs as well, and things like cloud have become, a big item on a lot of companies' accounts that are looking to reduce. So just moving on to, we obviously all know there's lots of cloud providers out there, and I'm sure many on this webinar are already using one of the providers on the screen, and but it is a difficult decision to make for a lot of companies, and it is every provider has its pros and cons. There's many factors that sort of play into why you might select one provider over another. But really today we're going to focus on cost, specifically on that, and talk about some of the, especially now diving into some of the principles that you can apply to reduce your cloud spend amongst all of these providers, not just picking out a single provider, and that includes Civo in that as well. Just to set the scene, it's worth a graphic on the next graphic that you're going to see. Talks about the cloud market in general, and this was a study done by Statista back in Q2 2022, and this really looks at the total cloud spend, and it's around about 200 billion market now, and you can see that Amazon has the lion's share of that, with 34% cloud spend with Amazon, and sort of fairly closely followed by Azure and Google. So there's probably no surprises there. But overall, that's 65% of market share with the big 3 providers. And out of the 8 providers on that graphic, I believe it's 82% market share within those providers. So I think that's what's interesting from that, is that it kind of, with so much spend with so few providers, if there is price sensitivity, if there are price rises and things, and not just looking at price, if we're looking at service quality and we're looking at outages and things like that, to have so much with so few does pose certain risks for businesses as well. So it's just worth thinking about that in the grand scheme of things. I'm just verifying those facts there. If we move on, I think what's interesting is there's a huge amount of press at the moment as well. If we just go back one slide. Oh, going back, there we go. Yeah, on this graphic, there's a huge amount of press at the moment in terms of price increases and price sensitivity within cloud. And I've just put on screen a few examples. Already there's been some quite large price increases in 2022. Google introduced a wave of price increases in October 2022. DigitalOcean increased their prices by 20% last year. Now, Microsoft have just announced a 9% increase on prices in the UK. And there's a lot of predictions around further price increases to come in 2023. And some of those are, more kind of could be devastating predictions, could be as much as 30% in Europe and 20% in the US over the next year. So it's quite scary with all the inflation that's going on, the energy crisis that's driving costs within data centers and chips that are becoming harder to get hold of and more expensive as well, playing into all these factors that are driving cost increase. So again, it's becoming such an important time to really look at ways to review your costs and reduce those costs. And Civo, we actually conducted a survey of 100 companies. This was sort of middle of last year, where we surveyed companies that used hyperscale providers, and they were companies of all sizes that we surveyed. And 45% of them indicated that they were under growing pressure to reduce their cloud costs. And 37% actually said that they'd receive unexpected bills from their cloud provider in the last 12 months. And then 34% felt locked into their current cloud provider. And by that last stat as well, you can see 65% of people said it was too expensive for them to actually leave their cloud provider because of things like high egress charges that I'm sure a lot of people are aware of, and has been well documented in the press in particular. And I even know that there's quite regulatory pressure now in various different countries about cloud lock-in and not charging egress fees to stop people leaving cloud providers. So it's quite a topical subject at the moment, and I think over the next year or two there could be some interesting developments from regulatory bodies that are trying to ban some of these practices of stopping people to leave. And I think one thing that's always certainly close to my heart, Civo, we're not a hyperscaler, but we're sometimes we like to think ourselves as a hyperscaler shaker, that we're trying to shake up the market and challenge that status quo. But not just Civo, there are other providers out there that are trying to do things differently, are provoking the kind of pricing models that are out there already, and trying to make change of an industry that is dominated by very few companies. And I think that's only a good thing, to have that choice and create some competition for some of the big providers, that even if it actually means that they have to change some of their pricing models and reduce costs, that can only be a good thing for the industry. But I think one of the things that when we looked at Civo and what we do, and we did a survey around this, we actually surveyed in the same survey I mentioned before, how many services companies were using within the cloud. And interestingly, 80% of respondents said they used less than 15 services. And when you look at companies like AWS that maybe offer hundreds of different products, it's quite surprising that most companies don't actually use that amount of services. And only 34% of companies use less than 5 services. So it's only really 20% we're saying that use more than 15 services in a provider like AWS. So I think there's the common misbelief sometimes that you have to be a hyperscaler because you need access to all these services. But in reality, lots of smaller and medium-sized businesses are probably better served with a smaller provider that's a lot more focused on their core services and offers a more predictable bill, no egress charges, the complexity is reduced in the process, efficiency can improve with a better developer experience, a simpler experience. And it's been, again, well documented that how complex some of these hyperscalers can be. And as well as things like enterprise support, it's quite often included with smaller providers and enhanced SLAs in certain areas. So I think, one thing I'd like people to think about is that, you don't always have to be with a hyperscaler to get a good level of service. And is it right to be spending almost a premium to be with a hyperscaler when there's other providers out there that can provide an equivalent or better service? And last slide before I hand over to Siam is it's worth thinking about a multi-cloud approach. And I don't always believe it should be a one-size-fits-all approach. And there's certain risks, as I highlighted, that if you do go for a one-size-fits-all approach, there are different providers out there. There are different providers that have their pros and cons. Some might be very focused on performance. Some might be more focused on costs. Some might be focused on high security environments or data sovereignty and things like that. So I think it's sometimes worth thinking about different workloads that you might run within your organization and how they might be better suited to having a varied multi-cloud approach. And, should you put certain environments with, a cost-effective provider versus a hyperscale provider and things like that. So it's always worth thinking about that. And in bigger companies, obviously, there's lots of different departments sometimes. And again, they may have different needs and different cloud providers may suit those changing needs. And I think there's a real cost efficiency to be gained through that multi-cloud approach.